The first thing we came across, and the way we chose to frame our journey, was through the lens of the catchment, an area of land including hills, woodlands and buildings, which water drains from before flowing into the streams and rivers. We found out this wasn't just a river, but a navigation, an intertwining of the canal and river, both affecting each other. We learnt about the geology, the gritstone, coal, limestone and carboniferous layers, and how they shaped the topography of the land.
The top of the catchment is really steep. When it rains, the water rushes down the narrow valley bottom and quickly overwhelms buildings, roads and railways. As it speeds up, it goes further down the catchment. The existing Victorian drainage system just cannot cope. The water continues down looking for somewhere to go. It reaches the floodplains and the houses that have been built on them. You told us that it was imperative to restore the peatlands. It stores carbon and is a natural sponge that can help absorb water and reduce flooding lower down the catchment. You told us you are amazed and in awe of the thousands of hours that volunteers put into protecting wildlife and supporting biodiversity gain. Sometimes volunteers and local conservation workers don't have the capacity to make this work sustainable in the long term.
You told us that there used to be a clear biodiversity action plan for the catchment, enabling close and opportunistic working relationships between charities and government. You also told us that this had fizzled out because of cutbacks. You told us grouse shooting had been happening on the uplands for 150 years. You also told us we can no longer afford the environmental costs of burning moorland for the purposes of grouse shooting. You told us that the natural flood management occurring across the catchment was heartening. You also told us about the challenges of getting NFM through current planning processes and your worries about who would maintain the NFM flood assets in the future. You told us of the multiple environmental benefits of NFM, but also the difficulty of proving these complex benefits to others.
You told us that farmers love the land they work. You also told us they work extremely hard and it is often not financially viable for them to engage in natural flood management projects. You also told us that farmers have seen a lot of policy changes. Once it was all about hedge payments and livestock levels, now it is about biodiversity gain.
You told us that local industry used to pollute the canal and rivers, and they ran black, red, purple and green with foam on top. Such visible pollution is now gone, and some of the old industry sites have become rich in biodiversity, which are sadly now being developed.
Todmorden's best kept secret is that it is home to the highest beach in the country.
You told us that statutory responsibilities around water supply sometimes undermine the possibility of using reservoirs to catch water during intense storms. You also told us this was one of many things that should be done to help manage flooding, and it was not a cure-all. You told us you had seen hobnail boots, mattresses, milk, road paint, bikes, shopping trolleys, carpets, animal carcasses, bottles, cans, footballs, polystyrene takeaway trays, great big pieces of metal, motorbikes, and even a transit van in the river and the canal.
You told us it is often difficult to get small repairs done on the locks, so sometimes you do them yourself. You also told us relying on volunteers for some things does not always work. You told us that the waterways were good for people's health and well-being, but sometimes the health of the canals themselves was not thought about carefully enough.
You told us that when the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fad passed, a lot of terrapins began to appear in the canal. You told us that the rivers had got cleaner, and species of fish that began to disappear 40 or 50 years ago had started to come back. You told us that there was just not enough money in the world to replace the Victorian drainage systems across the catchment. You told us how we expect the water to always flow from our taps. We pay for it after all.
You told us that a flood wall might protect the properties next to it, but it could speed up the water and flood neighbours downstream. You told us we seem to live under a regime where we must build houses as cheaply as possible, even on floodplains, even when we know storms are getting more intense and flooding is getting worse.
You told us that it's difficult to maintain pipes and prevent leakage in Calderdale because the topography means that the system has to be run at a really high pressure.
You told us that the drains cannot cope with the levels of surface water we are seeing because of overdevelopment and climate change. You also told us that working out who is responsible for the water that goes into drains is complicated. You told us that new sustainable urban drainage needs to be encouraged to take pressure off the drainage system, but sometimes it is not maintained in the long term.
You told us that people need to think more carefully about paving their driveways. Everyone in the catchment needs to help manage the drainage of surface water. You told us we should be collecting stormwater and using it to flush our toilets and water our gardens with.
You told us people do not seem to think about saving water as much as they used to.
You told us what it was like to see the water pour through the walls of your home, knowing that once you had cleared it up, it would all happen again. Managing flood risks. Who is responsible? DEFRA, the Environment Agency, lead local flood authorities, district councils, highway authority, water and sewage companies. Under the 2010 Flood and Water Management Act, all of the authorities above are bound by duty to cooperate and work in partnership to the benefit of their communities. There is some interesting politics. You've got this bureaucratic infrastructure of how we go on as a society and an economy, overlaid on a natural environment which comes back and bites you on the bum if you neglect or abuse it.
What we found in the Calder, people from very different places were coming together around a common concern with regard to flooding and climate change. There was a real commitment to try and understand where different people were coming from and why. But there were real challenges in coming together sometimes. People were stretched. Since the 2008 crash, there have been huge cuts to central government and local governments, so there's less resource for this kind of work. At the same time, there's been a move to empower communities to act on their kind of local area. There are lots of reasons for this. It's good for their health, it empowers them, and it means that the local area will be managed in a way that's right for them. But when you put both of these things together, there are some issues. So there are definitely issues for volunteers who engage in this work. Professionals who also do this work are stretched. Another point of tension was the different values and forms of valuation that drove the different people and organisations involved in this work. So, for example, it was difficult to show the value of sustainable approaches to natural flood management. The aims and values that underpinned different government policies sometimes undermined each other. And the aims of different organisations who were involved in flood management were often difficult to resolve.
But what else is going on? What of the wider picture? Over time, we have increasingly thought of ourselves as separate from nature. And when you separate from something, when you disconnect from it, it becomes easier to not care for it, to forget about it, and to take from it. This has led to a situation where we have allowed ourselves to extract the Earth's resources and pollute for financial profit. And we do that more than we protect and sustain. The consequences of this are deforestation, ocean acidification, soil degradation, biodiversity loss, pollution, and of course climate change. And with climate change comes more rain and more flooding. So now we are living with these things. We don't have any choice but to explore alternative ways to think about and manage our common resources that we need to survive. And we must do this in a sustainable way. Transformations in economic, social, technological and political decisions and actions can enhance adaptation and promote sustainable development. Restricting adaptation responses to incremental changes to existing systems and structures without considering transformational change may increase cost and losses and miss opportunities. You will have to understand that to trust in capitalism as it presents itself today, as the best friend of the earth, as green, concerned about protection and sustainability, would be to commit to the same kind of error as the frog in the fable, who agrees to carry a scorpion on his back across the river. If the scorpion stung him, wouldn't they both drown? And yet the scorpion stings him, right in the middle of the river. With his last breath, the frog murmured, "Why?" To which the scorpion, just before sinking, responded, "It's in my nature. I couldn't help doing it." It's in the nature of capitalism to exploit opportunities. It cannot help doing it. So what does this all mean in the Calder catchment? It means that often those who are trying to do something about flooding and climate change are swimming upstream. They don't have the proper resources, the money or the time to do the work properly. They end up relying on people with passion and energy to drive projects forward, and this is not sustainable. The policies and governance structures in place to guide flooding and climate adaptation are often undermined by policies focused on other areas of economic, social and political life. This slows down action, and time is something we really don't have. So all of the knowledge, cooperation, understanding, passion, care, concern and love people have for the Calder and its rivers, canals, peatlands, lagoons, wildlife, plants and old mills are not always given the chance to come together and thrive. So what do we do about this? How do the people in the Calder catchment realign themselves with their natural systems so that both can thrive? How can we overcome and change the values we currently live by to ensure that care for the earth and care for people are one in the same thing? If the laws, policies and values we live by do not protect the natural systems we need to survive and thrive, then we need to create new ones. A policy that cares for the people as much as it does for the natural systems that support them. Can we reimagine?